Then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the matter of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new sepulcher, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulcher was nigh at hand. It is said that Jesus was God manifest in human form, and that he lived his life like a common mortal. Then what happened to his body? According to the Bible, when Jesus rose from the dead, he returned to heaven. Historians question this literal interpretation of the Gospels. Some even believe that his remains are still buried somewhere. But where?
There are many different ways to bury someone. I'd like to point that out. If you reflect for a bit, you'll realize that there were thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, maybe even hundreds of thousands living in Judea, in Galilee, in the East. You know, those people over the years, over generations, over the course of centuries, over the course of millenniums, there had to be millions of people who died in that country. But we have only found a few. That's pretty rare.
The tomb of Jesus. Its location is still uncertain. John the Apostle speaks of a garden near the site of the crucifixion. The Gospel of Luke describes it as a sepulcher that was hewn in stone, a gift from Joseph of Arimathea. And Mark adds that the tomb was sealed with a huge stone that was rolled in front of the entrance to the tomb.
There are 1,800 tombs. The Israelis have done the calculations. There are 1,800 tombs around Jerusalem. A few of them are common graves with several bodies buried inside. But that's not very many. Actually, all that has been found are the tombs of rich people, people who had enough money to pay for a tomb to be carved out of the rock, or to have a sort of trough dug out with raised stones to create a hole, a burial vault. Most people were simply buried in the ground. So when the Gospels describe it as a tomb, properly prepared, with a large stone that can be rolled and where the body is laid out on a table, well, that says a lot right there. I can show you a tomb like that here in the garden. There are tombs here with a table that the body laid upon while it decomposed. So this type of burial service is practically aristocratic. And it raises a theological question. How did this poor prophet, who was barely known, who walked from Galilee with a handful of followers, come to be buried like an aristocrat?
Jerusalem was the stage for the Passion of Christ. The Holy City remains a unique and fascinating pilgrimage site. In the center of the Holy City lies the Old City, surrounded by high walls. Many pilgrims believe that these old streets are the same ones that Jesus walked upon when he came to Jerusalem. That's not true. Shortly after Jesus died, Herod Agrippa, king of Judea and grandson of Herod the Great, had new walls built on the north side. When the walls were added, the city got bigger, and its size was about the same as the old city is now.
But at the time of Jesus, there was no building here.
Correct.
So it was, in fact, it was outside the gate, outside the walls of Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we are inside the old city of Jerusalem, but at the time it was outside the walls.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. The crucifixion had to happen outside the walls. It would have been against the sentiment of the people to have it inside.
When Jesus was alive, all criminals were executed outside of the city walls. The place we are standing now is where, after Jesus was arrested, he was brought before Pontius Pilate, who gave in to the crowd and condemned Jesus to be crucified. Jesus was then taken away from the palace court. It is believed that he walked along the Via Dolorosa, which literally means way of grief or way of suffering, until he reached the crucifixion site. Every year, thousands of pilgrims travel to Jerusalem to follow in Jesus' footsteps.
This is a very special moment for pilgrims when they come to the Holy Sepulcher, because it's the most treasured shrine of prayer in the entire earth for Christians. Mm-hmm. It's the place where Christ shed his blood for us, and even more importantly, where he rose from the dead.
Who was this Jesus of Nazareth? What did he do to deserve such cruel treatment?
He was a prophet who went around telling people things he wasn't supposed to say, but that people like to hear. He was a simple man from the province of Galilee. You know, Galilee was a province, just like Quebec, and it was far from the capital. In Jerusalem, there were all sorts of intellectuals. There was political power, religious power. So here was this man from Galilee, walking along the road with his disciples, and he arrived in Jerusalem. He was quite surprised by the magnificence of the large buildings, particularly the temple, which dominated the city, with its Greek architecture, etc. So I prefer to say that the Jesus who arrived in Jerusalem, before he went and insulted practically everyone, was someone that no one really paid attention to. And he was a prophet. He told people things he wasn't supposed to say, or that they didn't want to hear. And that's when people began to say, "Who is that man?" The things he spoke of were pretty serious. So some people would stop and say, "He speaks the truth." Others would say, "He's a liar." The Romans were never happy about the fact that Palestine, or Judea, was resisting their rule. Judea's attitude was, "We don't want any Romans around here. Go away. We have our country, our religion, our culture. We don't want anything to do with the Romans." The truth is, the Roman soldiers were far from being distinguished officers, far from being police-like troops. They were mercenaries. They spoke different languages. They had different customs. They were from different countries. You could say that it was a bit of a melting pot. So basically, the presence of the Roman army wasn't felt very strongly. Sure, it was present. There was a Judean government in place with the Romans in the background. You know, it was kind of like the situation in Iraq. The war was not as strong, not as brutal, but it was still there, simmering in the background. The people had no use for the occupying forces, and the occupants were forced to strike and destroy the country in the year 70. So it was in this climate of tension, rejection, and resistance that the events of Jesus' life took place.
Once he was outside of the city walls, Jesus was taken to a place called Golgotha, which literally means place of the skull. Again, the exact location is uncertain.
Yeah, I would think so. If you're little children in catechism, you draw a big mountain.
Exactly, and
you'd have the three crosses on top. In some of the films we have seen about the Passion of Christ also presented like that. So we have that impression in our mind, and we need to adjust it when we come here to reality.
Golgotha was a skull-shaped rocky escarpment near the Jaffa Gate, and it was here that the Church of the Holy Sepulcher was built.
However, if we go back to the history of this place,
There was this beautiful building constructed in the 7th century. It's one of the only monuments from antiquity still standing today, from the Istanbul and Roman empires. Everyone should come and see it, regardless of what their religion may be. They should come and see the rock. Jews, Christians, Muslims. There's no excuse not to. A prayer spoken in any language, any religion, is not going to wear out the rock.
The Church of the Holy Sepulcher is the most popular tourist site in Jerusalem. Accompanied by Father Eamon Kelly of the Pontifical Institute Notre Dame of Jerusalem Center, I managed to slip past the hundreds of tourists who flock to this extraordinary site each day.
So we have a lot of pilgrims right here. Is it always that crowded, or is it just because we are in the Passover?
obviously it's more intensely visited now because of the Orthodox Easter. They're all wanting to visit the tomb, and they know that that will be very difficult in the next 4 or 5 days, so they're willing to wait a couple of hours to get in. Only 4 or 5 people can fit inside the chamber where the tomb is, and sometimes they will wait 2 or 3 or 4 hours. We've often had pilgrims at Notre Dame who are waiting half a day, and they're so proud that they were able to get in, and because of the waiting crowd, you don't want to stay too long.
Yeah.
So you have a few moments of prayer inside and taking it in, what's there in the tomb chamber.
For centuries, Christians in Jerusalem have been commemorating these sites as the place where the Passion of Christ took place. A few meters from this rock, there used to be a hole dug in the rock, a cave which, according to tradition, was the tomb where Jesus' body was laid before he rose from the dead. This hole now lies at the heart of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, also known as Anastasis. In the middle of this rotunda is the Edicule, which holds the tomb of Jesus Christ and the chapel of the angel. Entering this small structure, it is hard to imagine that the interior was once a tomb carved in the rock. This chamber, called the Chapel of the Angel, is where a messenger appeared before Mary Magdalene and Jesus' mother Mary to announce Jesus' resurrection.
This chapel is called the Chapel of the Angels in reference to the gospel account of the angels when the women came to the tomb, and there were 2 angels sitting there, and they said, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" So this chapel commemorates this moment of the gospel account. Right.
When we talk about this big block of rock that was covering the entrance of the tomb, it was, I suppose that it was just right
Exactly.
here.
This would be the doorway to the tomb here.
Behind the chapel is a door which leads to a smaller chamber, the tomb of Jesus. According to Christian tradition, this is where Jesus' body was laid after he was taken down from the cross. It's also the place where he performed his greatest miracle of all, his own resurrection. Heading to the south part of the church, the main area of the Orthodox Greeks, we arrive at the most lavishly decorated part of the entire Holy Sepulcher complex. Sheets of glass cover a rock that is believed to be Golgotha. A small altar has been set up between the glass sheets. Beneath the altar is a marble slab, pierced with a 15-centimeter wide hole. Sliding under the altar, it is possible to place your hand in the opening and touch a piece of the rock. According to tradition, this is where the cross was raised. For many Christians throughout the world, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher is the holiest place on earth. But how can we verify the authenticity of this site? One thing for sure is that this site has always had an aura of holiness about it.
First of all, there was probably some Christian structure here at the time of, in the 2nd century. In 134, you had the uprising from Bar Kokhba, in the early 130s. That's 100 years after Christ. And the Romans didn't like that at all, so Hadrian really squashed Jerusalem. And they report that he built a temple to Jupiter on the Dome of the Rock area, in the temple area.
Okay.
And just imagine what an offense that was for the Jewish people, to build a temple to Jupiter. And then they built apparently a temple here over the tomb to Venus. And on the one hand, Hadrian and his people thought by this way they were going to eradicate the memory. And what really happened was that when 200 years later Constantine came, or Helen, and this new period started, there was a very clear indication of where the tomb was. Obviously the living tradition was very strong also, and the people knew where they would find it.
The Roman Empire's attempts to cut off access to this burial site by building a temple on it show how important the site was in the eyes of Christians. What's more, the location matches the description found in the Gospels and archaeological discoveries made in Old Jerusalem. But there is another possible burial site, other than the Church of the Holy Sepulcher.
There's here in Jerusalem, you have two places known as the Jesus tomb.
Right.
It's this one and the garden tomb. What is the difference between both?
Well, there's a huge difference. The garden tomb looks much more like what the scene may have been 2,000 years ago, because it's a relatively untouched site with ancient burial places. The archaeologists say are some hundreds of years before Christ, as far as I read. And then it has serenity to the gardens and the atmosphere around it. It's easier to take out the gospel passage and understand what happened on Easter Sunday morning.
Outside of the old city, not far from what is now the Damas Gate, is a place whose name was inspired by the description of Christ's burial chamber found in the Gospel of John. The Garden Tomb. It's a beautiful garden, an oasis of peace in the middle of the chaos of Jerusalem. Archaeological digs in the 1970s confirmed that it was a Christian sepulcher dating back to the 1st century. The inside of this sepulcher is without a doubt closer to the image that we have traditionally been given of the tomb of Jesus compared to what tourists see in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. The tomb is made up of two separate areas, one where the body was prepared and one where it was laid to rest.
Well, back when Jesus was alive, the most common method of burying someone involved two steps. The first step was a ceremony that took place the day the person died. It was very important for this step to be completed before nightfall. Friends and family would gather at the family tomb, which was always outside of the city. And then the body would be placed in a room that was dug into the rock, which had lengthwise cavities carved into it. So the body was placed in this cavity. Then prayers were recited, and the body was rubbed with spices. Next, the body was wrapped in a shroud, which was a large sheet usually made of linen. And then the body was left in the tomb for about a year, long enough for the skin and flesh to decompose, leaving only the bones remaining. At that point, the family returned to the tomb and performed a second ceremony, during which they gathered the bones and placed them in a small stone box that was called an ossuary. It was basically a square stone urn.
Although the garden tomb is closer to the idealized image that we have of the sepulcher of Christ, historians remain skeptical as to its authenticity. Their main argument is the lack of Christian tradition associated with the site. But tradition doesn't necessarily guarantee historic truth. In 2007, a documentary entitled The Lost Tomb of Jesus aired on an American television network. The documentary was produced by none other than Hollywood director James Cameron. According to the documentary, while excavation work was being done in 1980 in the Talpiot area just outside of Jerusalem, the workers discovered a Jewish tomb dating back to the 1st century.
So, as is often the case, this tomb was discovered due to construction work that had nothing to do with archaeology. A bulldozer breaking the ground for a new building hit the top of the tomb. Then everything stopped and authorities were called in from the Department of Archaeology. They ordered a search of the area. Archaeologists searched the grounds and found a classic tomb, typical of the sepulchres that existed back in Jesus' day. It was a catacomb dug into the rock on a hillside. Cavities had been carved into the rock, some lengthwise, referred to as locally, and some sideways, referred to as arcosolium.
The tomb was searched in the 1980s by an archaeologist who is a buddy of mine, Amos Kloner. He's a very nice guy, very honest. A good archaeologist. He doesn't have his head in the clouds. So he found this tomb and he was happy because it contained ossuaries. And what's interesting about ossuaries is the names that are engraved upon them. So when he found a bunch of them in a tomb that had not been disturbed, a bunch of ossuaries where they should be on shelves against the wall of the tomb with their names inscribed, well, that was a great archaeological discovery. He had his findings published and they went completely unnoticed.
Without further ceremony, the ossuaries were removed from the tomb and shipped to a warehouse belonging to the Israel Antiquities Authority. For 20 years, the Talpiot tomb discovery was of no interest to anyone. Ten of these ossuaries were discovered in the Talpiot tomb. 6 of them bore the names of the deceased whose bones they contained, which was not common practice, one of them being Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. The 5 other ossuaries also bore names that are quite significant to Christians. Maria, which means Mary. Yosa, which is a nickname for Joseph. Mattia, which means Matthew. Yehuda bar Yeshua, which means Judas, son of Jesus. And finally, Mara, or Mariamne, meaning Mary Magdalene. In the 2000s, a Canadian journalist of Jewish origin, Simcha Jacobovici, discovered this story and began to wonder, could this tomb possibly have belonged to Jesus of Nazareth's family?
In ancient times, physical evidence was not used to prove that a person had existed. There were written accounts of the person's life, and in Jesus' case, there are certainly plenty of accounts of his life, some from Christian sources, some from Latin sources, all written in a factual tone. Everyone leaves behind physical evidence of their existence, but that disappears over time. And even when the evidence does exist, it takes someone pretty skillful to recognize the remains. You need an inscription that is perfectly explicit and unique to identify the owner of the ossuary. So if we take the name Jesus, for instance, the inscription on the ossuary said, Jesus, son of Joseph. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was referring exclusively to Jesus of Nazareth, since hundreds of people could have been known by that name back then.
In the documentary The Lost Tomb of Jesus and the book of the same title that followed it, Jacobovici used statistics to prove that the tomb of Talpiot was indeed that of Jesus' family. What are the odds, he asked, of finding the names Joseph, Mary, Mary Magdalene, and Jesus, son of Joseph, all in the same tomb?
The truth is, epigraphers, scholars who study and decipher ancient inscriptions, have not all agreed on the interpretation of the names. It's possible that it was Jesus. It's possible that it was Judas. It's possible that it was Mary, and that there was a Mary Magdalene. But it is yet to be proven. You know, deciphering those names is pretty complicated.
Skillfully presented in the documentary The Lost Tomb of Jesus, Jacobovici's discoveries and speculations came as a shock to the archaeological community.
Suddenly, they became the object of a media circus. And there was a certain commercialism to the whole thing that left us disheartened.
People began to ask why archaeologists at the Israel Antiquities Authority were not struck by this group of biblical names at the time of their discovery. How could such a discovery have gone unnoticed by Israeli archaeologists?
Jesus is one way of writing the name. The Hebrew form is Joshua. Joshua means Joshua. So that leads us to the book of Joshua in the Bible. Since Joshua was the one who conquered, or who allegedly conquered Palestine, he became a legendary hero, founder of a people, a nation. So it was a good name. We can only imagine that Americans named their children Lincoln, etc. So it was a name that was extremely widespread and honorable. It was a good thing for people to name their son Jesus. And there were a lot of men named Jesus back then. It's easy. I can show you one. I have one in my office, an ossuary cover from the same time period, which could definitely date back to the exact time of Jesus' death. And on the cover is the inscription, Jesus. Iota, Eta, Sigma, Omicron, Upsilon, Sigma, Jesus. So we know that there were bones inside. I don't have them anymore. From a man named Jesus.
The form in which the inscriptions were written is not the form which you'd expect the epigraph of a Nazarene to be written. Yeshua ben Yosef is the way that a Judean would write the name. It's not the way that a Nazarene would write his name. Also, the form of the burial doesn't look at all like the kind of burial which Jesus would have had. Firstly, if this is a burial of Jesus, you'd expect him to be buried in the Galilee. He was a Galilean boy. Secondly, he was a poor Galilean boy. This is a rich man's tomb in Jerusalem.
I went to Bet Shemesh, west of Jerusalem, where the Israeli Antiquities Authority gave me permission to see, touch, and film the ossuaries that Simcha Jacobovici was so excited about. After a thorough examination, Jacobovici's theory that the tomb of Talpiot belonged to Jesus and his family could not, unfortunately, stand up to analysis. Archaeologists said that they were shocked by the methods used by Jacobovici and the liberties that he took, describing his documentary as nothing more than mere entertainment and fictional archaeology. Then Christians around the world were angry at the journalists for having questioned the Holy Scriptures and having ignored one of the fundamental dogmas of Christian faith, Jesus' resurrection on the third day. If he rose from the dead, there's no way his bones could have been placed in an ossuary buried in a tomb near Jerusalem.
Would the discovery of Jesus' bones challenge the mystery of the resurrection? Absolutely. If the bones of Jesus are dug up tomorrow in Palestine, Christianity will have been shown conclusively to have been a lie. Christianity stands and falls on the evidence of the resurrection. If Jesus' bones are there to be found, and Christianity is a lie which we should all abandon now.
The Gospels are silent about many things. That's not an argument to prove, but it also allows a great liberty. The Gospel is very selective in the facts it presents. The evangelists, the authors of the Gospels, declare that themselves very explicitly, either at the beginning or the end of the Gospel. In St. John's Gospel it says, if we were to write down all the things, the world wouldn't hold all the books that would be written about the life of Christ. I could imagine if you have a family member who has been killed in an accident and suddenly is alive in your house, it's kind of unimaginable. You'll take a lot of pictures, but the pictures are secondary. The whole focus is on the fact that the person is here and you celebrate the person.
Shortly after the resurrection, the disciples gathered on a mountainside, and Jesus appeared before them. but not everyone recognized him. But some doubted, says Matthew. The Gospel according to Mark also speaks of Jesus after he has risen, but describes him as appearing in a different form without giving details. The Gospel of Luke tells how two disciples were walking along the road to Emmaus, and Jesus joined them, walking with them all the way to town. As they walked, the two disciples carried on a conversation, unaware that their companion was the Messiah. John wrote that a man spoke to Mary Magdalene, and she thought that he was the gardener. It wasn't until she had been speaking to him for a few minutes that she finally realized that the man was Jesus. These are a few anecdotes that are disturbing, to say the least. The appearances didn't happen years after Jesus' death. It had only been a few days since his crucifixion. How is it that these people who saw Jesus Christ did not recognize him?
Now we're getting into theology. According to theology, Jesus' resurrection is a very, very deep inner experience. If we look at the actions of the disciples, we see that Paul started off as a persecutor of Christians, and then suddenly he came face to face with the living Christ, risen from the dead, on the road to Damascus. And Jesus said to him, "Why do you persecute me?" So, coming to understand the resurrection is a very personal experience.
Some religious commentators have suggested a new reading of this portion of the Gospels, one in which the focus shifts from the historical accuracy of events to their symbolic significance. But even with the best intentions in the world, there is no denying that there are several details that suggest there actually was a physical resurrection. After all, didn't John mention that linen clothes used to wrap Jesus' body were now lying on the ground, and the sudarium used around his head was wrapped together in a place by itself? These are details that are difficult to ascribe to a simple writing style. Everything is worded as if Jesus' body had genuinely disappeared. Jesus really rise from the dead as he had foretold? But if he did, why didn't the disciples recognize him? Did Jesus survive the crucifixion and head to India, Japan, or even France, where he died years later, as claimed in some pretty surprising legends?
It's suggested by several people that Jesus survived the crucifixion and that he migrated east. Where he went is the subject of many stories. There are villages in Turkey and along the Silk Route. Perhaps the most famous of these traditions is the tradition of Jesus in India. It's suggested that Jesus migrated east with his mother and arrived at Srinagar in Kashmir. And there is a tomb there called the Rosabal, which is said to be the tomb of Yusuf, Jesus.
According to an ancient tradition dating back to the 1st century, Yusuf was both a prince and a prophet who arrived in Kashmir after having survived crucifixion in the lands of the sons of Israel. Sacred texts describe how King Shalivahan met this Yusuf, a man with fair skin, dressed in white garments, who said that he was called the Son of God and was born of a virgin. Other Hindu documents of the same time period say that Yusuf called himself Jesus of Nazareth.
Some people say that the tomb is orientated in the way in which only a Jewish tomb would be orientated, that it was painted the Jewish colors of blue and white. And perhaps most interestingly, there was uncovered from outside the tomb, originally covered in wax, some footprints which are alleged to show the nail marks in Jesus' feet.
The martyr's tomb in Srinagar has 2 sarcophaguses, but the real tombs lie beneath floor level. Although the sarcophagus containing the remains of Sayyid Nasiruddin points north-south, as was the Muslim custom, the one containing the prophet Yusuf points east-west, as was the Jewish custom. This positioning proves that Yusuf was not an Islamic saint or a Hindu. What if it actually was Jesus Christ?
The Gospel of Thomas, for example, speaks of a long trip taken by Jesus to India. Why is that? Well, it's because this is a gospel written by Christians living in India who wanted to enjoy the experience of having Jesus living amongst them.
And the people who subscribe to the Jesus in India theory say that there are corroborating texts. For example, near Dal Lake in Srinagar, there's a pillar with an inscription on it which refers to a Messiah figure who came over to India. By the time that these stories arose, there was a long tradition of missionary activity in these areas, and probably what happened with these texts which mentioned Jesus as the sadhu was attempts by Hindus worried about the proselytization of their people by Christians. They thought that the best way of inoculating the local population against Christian missionary activity was to make Jesus into an Indian sadhu who didn't really have much to add to what Hinduism was already telling them.
Every day in the small village of Shingo, which used to be known as Herai in northern Japan, dozens of pilgrims travel to a place where a cross sits on a mound. According to local tradition, this hill is none other than the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. According to Australian scientist Tom J. Chalko, the children of Shingo still chant a nursery rhyme with words that are absolutely meaningless to them. For generations, the children of Shingo have been passing these words on, not knowing what they meant. This gibberish was actually the phonetic pronunciations of Hebraic words inspired by the Torah, the first books of the Old Testament. Could the martyr's tomb in Shingo be Jesus of Nazareth's genuine sepulcher?
Specialists arrived at the following conclusion. These stories reveal that there were Christian communities in these countries who likely passed on their legend from one generation to the next. Or there is a chance that something actually did occur in these places. Some people even believe that the stories were a way of legitimizing things. For instance, they could have been used to justify the popularity of one location over another. But when you look at all the dynamics involved, when you examine all these tombs and hear people claiming, "I have found the tomb of Jesus, I am the one who identified it, and now it belongs to me," you see that there's a desire for validation behind it all. There is a sense of, now I am important. And it's believed that this dynamic has come into play in countries like Kashmir or Japan, for instance.
Throughout the centuries, Christian communities have been so ardent in their desire to feel Christ's presence among them that their religious fervor has led to the creation and sustainment of highly unlikely theories.
So people may claim that they might have found the tomb of Jesus here or there. And I would say, rather than looking in India, we should be directing our attention to Ethiopia, where in Lalibela, poor Ethiopians who had no way of making the Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem have reconstructed the Holy Land in their mountains. You have the Cedron Brook. You have the Holy Sepulcher. You have the house of Caiaphas. You have Bethany. You have the tomb of Lazarus. They reconstructed it all. And of course, in the heart of Ethiopia, you have the tomb of Jesus Christ. There's no denying that when Ethiopian pilgrims travel on their knees to the tomb of Jesus, well, in some way, it's really there.
According to another tradition, this one dating back to the Middle Ages, Jesus went to France after escaping execution. Legend has it that he was joined by a few disciples and his wife, Mary Magdalene, and that he settled down somewhere near Rennes-le-Château.
The mystery of Jesus' possible marriage to Mary Magdalene and the possible family that they could well have had, I think, for me, does not detract from his divinity, from his death and resurrection. I would say that whether he was married to Mary or not, that he was crucified, that he did die on Calvary, and that he did make the resurrection appearances, the first of which, incidentally, was to the wife who loved him in the garden. and that he then ascended to heaven after that period. Now, the upholders of the version of, oh, Jesus was married to Mary and Christianity is a myth, cannot accept that he was both, whereas I believe that he was. Now, if we go along with their legends about Jesus turning up in India, Jesus turning up in Japan, Jesus turning up in all sorts of unexpected corners of the world, perhaps even making a third visit to Britain, as our poet sings and did those feat in ancient times. No, I don't believe that he went anywhere after the crucifixion except to make his resurrection appearances and then to go back to be with his Father, where, as I always say when someone has been bereaved, where he waits to welcome us and the loved ones we've lost.
Some 2,000 years ago, a young carpenter from the small town of Nazareth began preaching messages of love, compassion, and forgiveness. Over a short period of 3 years, this preacher, accompanied by a handful of disciples, traveled throughout Galilee, spreading this message of love, which the high priest considered to be heresy.
Look at Jesus' story. Okay, so he came from Galilee with his disciples. Who were they? How many of them were there? Clearly, the Gospels say that there were 12, but that should be verified, except that it can't be verified. So he arrives with friends and with other people who were fascinated by what he'd been saying and doing, people who wanted to follow him, listen to him. He probably stayed with friends in an outlying area, but he wouldn't have stayed in Jerusalem itself. The city was too heavy for him, the energy was too strong, and since he already knew that things would end badly, he didn't insist.
His ministry came to a dramatic end when he was condemned and executed by the Romans. The Passion of Christ began with his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and ended in some ways with his resurrection. This was the fulfilling of the prophecy. When the announcement was made that Jesus had risen, many of his contemporaries believed that the body had simply been stolen to give the impression that the prophecy had come true. Even Pilate himself had anticipated this possibility and had ordered that guards be posted in front of the tomb. When we understand that the resurrection is a major dogma of Christianity, it is hard to imagine that the disciples would have accepted being persecuted if they had known that the tenet of their faith was nothing more than a hoax. Jesus' resurrection is the greatest of all miracles ever performed. There is nothing that comes even close to it in the ancient world.
It may surprise you to know that, well, the resurrection of Jesus Christ cannot be historically proven. Researchers can find all the bones they want, but what has that got to do with the resurrection? Jesus' resurrection is not something palpable, not something identifiable. It's not historic. It cannot be traced. End of story.
The search for Jesus' tomb forces us to reflect on the mystery surrounding his resurrection, as well as the origins of Christianity. We have no historic certainty of where exactly he traveled, nor the exact location of his birth or death. We have no documents that were written by Jesus himself, only texts left by disciples several decades after his death. Basically, he was quite an unassuming prophet. And yet, his execution caused a real tidal wave in the Roman Empire. Less than 300 years after his crucifixion, Rome, the birthplace of his executioners, had converted to his message. Nowadays, Christianity is the largest religion in the world with close to 3 billion followers. Not bad for a public nuisance, whose existence is still doubted by some.